What would you think if the woman her own family mocked as a failure was actually the one secretly holding the evidence that could bring an entire empire crashing down? They laughed at me for scrubbing hospital floors, but they didn't know it was from down there that I saw every ounce of their rot. My name is Sloane, and this is the story of how an invisible woman dragged her own powerful family into the light. For 3 years, my family believed I was a failure, a woman who spent her nights scrubbing hospital toilets while they built an empire of greed. They thought they knew my place. They were dead wrong. My father stood on the high podium of the stateroom, holding a $500 glass of red wine, proudly lecturing 150 elite guests about the perfection of the Brooks legacy. When his eyes caught me standing in the shadows, a smug, intellectual sneer crept across his face. He didn't shout. Instead, his voice dripped with calculated contempt. "Our family has always aimed for the pinnacle, but my daughter chose a more humble path. She prefers cleaning up filth at Mercy Hospital, making her the kind of woman no man would ever want to call his wife." A ripple of snickering erupted across the luxurious 33rd floor ballroom. My brother stood beside him, adjusting his silk tie with a look of triumphant arrogance. I didn't cry, and I didn't argue. I calmly walked toward the table of the largest shareholders, pulled out my Boston Mercy janitorial ID, and placed it firmly on the marble surface. I stared directly into my father's eyes, the man who believed he had just delivered the perfect public execution of my dignity. Sometimes the person cleaning the floors is the only one who truly sees the rot festering beneath the glamour. Subscribe. Now you won't want to miss how I sweep this trash out into the light. The suffocating scent of expensive leather and polished mahogany always defined my father's office at the Brooks Pharmaceutical headquarters. 3 years ago, I wasn't a woman with dirt under her fingernails. I was a senior data analyst, the golden child destined to safeguard the family's clinical integrity. Arthur Brooks sat behind his desk, sliding a thick blue folder toward me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't ask about my week or my life. He only asked for my digital signature on the final safety validation for Project Verity, our new high-stakes oncology drug. I opened the file, but as I scrolled through the heart rate variability and toxicity markers, the numbers began to scream at me. The raw data I had processed a week prior showed a 15% increase in severe adverse reactions among the Phase 3 trial participants, yet this summarized report displayed a flawless safety profile. Someone had systematically scrubbed the failures, turning a dangerous liability into a billion-dollar miracle. I looked up, my heart hammering against my ribs, and told Arthur Brooks that there was a massive discrepancy in the survival rates. My father didn't even flinch, casually leaning back in his chair while explaining that minor statistical anomalies had been smoothed out for the sake of the company's public offering. He told me that as a Brooks, my loyalty belonged to the legacy, not to a spreadsheet. I realized then that my father wasn't asking for my expertise. He was asking for my complicity in a crime that could cost thousands of lives. When I flatly refused to authorize the fraudulent data, the room turned ice cold. Arthur stood up, his face reddening as he called me an ungrateful child who didn't understand the complexities of global business. He gave me a final ultimatum: sign the report, or leave the building with nothing but the clothes on my back. He sneered, claiming he would blackball me from every medical research firm in New England, ensuring I'd never find a professional desk to sit at again. I didn't hesitate. I walked out of that skyscraper, leaving my company badge on the glass table and ignoring my brother Garrett's mocking laughter as he watched me being escorted out by security. The transition from a penthouse lifestyle to a cramped studio in a forgotten corner of the city was brutal, but it provided the perfect cover for a ghost. I spent those first months in exile, reaching out to federal contacts I had made during my university years, eventually catching the attention of the Office of Inspector General. They needed someone who knew the Brooks Group from the inside, someone invisible enough to walk through their most secure facilities without raising an alarm. I traded my tailored suits for a nondescript gray uniform and began the slow, agonizing process of documenting the truth from the very bottom of the food chain. My father thought he had destroyed my future, but he had actually given me the ultimate weapon: total anonymity within his own fortress. The smell of hospital-grade disinfectant and industrial floor wax soon replaced the lingering aroma of my father's expensive cigars. Joining the Office of Inspector General under a joint task force with the CDC gave me the legal shield I needed, but it required a total erasure of Sloane Brooks, the heiress. My new identity was a ghost in a gray jumpsuit, a contract janitor assigned to the restricted pharmaceutical storage wings of Boston Mercy Hospital. This facility was the crown jewel of my father's distribution network, making it the perfect ground zero for my investigation. While the doctors and nurses hurried past me as if I were part of the furniture, I was observing the invisible trail of every vial that entered the building. Being a member of the night shift cleaning crew granted me unparalleled access to the place's security cameras rarely focused on. My primary targets were the medical waste bins in the high-stakes oncology units. Each night as I emptied the yellow biohazard containers, I wasn't just collecting trash. I was gathering discarded drug packaging and empty vials to cross-reference their batch numbers. I learned to move with a quiet, practiced invisibility, my eyes scanning for the Brooks Group logo while my hands worked the mop. I discovered that the most damning evidence often hid in the residue of what the world wanted to forget. The janitorial cart became my mobile laboratory, hidden in plain sight, allowing me to transport sensitive samples to a secure drop-off point without a second glance from the hospital's high-tech security detail. Life outside the hospital walls shifted to a cramped, drafty studio apartment in Dorchester, miles away from the manicured lawns of my childhood. Every evening before my shift began, the small wooden table in my kitchen transformed into a digital war room. Under the dim glow of a single lamp, I spent hours meticulously inputting the serial numbers I had salvaged from the hospital's waste. I compared these real-world batch codes against the official shipping manifests provided by the Brooks Group. The patterns I uncovered were chilling. According to the records, the hospital was receiving top-tier bioengineered treatments, but the chemical markers on the vials I recovered told a different story. They were watered-down counterfeits possessing just enough active ingredients to pass a basic test, but not enough to save a life. Martha, my mother, occasionally punctured my silence with venomous text messages, reminding me how much of an embarrassment I had become to the family name. She would send photos of Garrett receiving accolades at prestigious medical galas, juxtaposing his success against my perceived squalor. I never replied. I let the sting of her words fuel my resolve as I documented the cold, hard data. My father and brother believed they were untouchable behind their walls of wealth and prestige, but they failed to realize that the woman they thought was scrubbing their floors was actually dismantling their empire one batch number at a time. I was no longer just a daughter seeking justice. I was a silent predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The sterile fluorescent hum of the hospital's basement storage unit provided a grim sanctuary for my investigation. It was a labyrinth of steel shelves and heavy shadows, a place where the prestige of medical science met the cold reality of logistics. As I navigated my heavy cleaning cart through the narrow aisles, the sudden click of polished Oxfords against the concrete floor echoed through the silence. I didn't need to look up to recognize that rhythmic, arrogant stride. Garrett Brooks stepped into the dim light of the pharmaceutical bay, his pristine white lab coat a sharp contrast to the dingy gray of my uniform. He was no longer just my brother. He was the newly appointed chief of surgery, the man whose administrative power acted as the final filter for every drug entering Boston Mercy. He stopped directly in front of my cart, blocking my path, with a smirk that radiated pure malice. Garrett didn't see a federal agent or a sister. He saw a convenient target for his deep-seated insecurities. Without a word, he reached into the leather portfolio tucked under his arm and casually swept a thick stack of procurement files onto the floor. The papers scattered across the dusty concrete like fallen leaves. He leaned against a metal rack, watching me with cold amusement as he told me to clean up the mess. He sneered, remarking that the sister who once boasted about her genius for complex mathematics and data sets had finally found her true calling, counting trash bags and mopping up spills. His voice was a low, jagged blade slicing through the quiet air as he reminded me that I was a stain on the family's flawless reputation. I remained silent, sinking to my knees to gather the scattered documents. It was a position of forced submission that clearly fed his ego, but it gave me exactly what I needed. As I reached for a heavy blue folder labeled High Priority Distribution, my heart skipped a beat. There, at the bottom of a manifest dated just 2 days prior, was the definitive proof of the Brooks Group's criminal network. It was an authorization form for a massive shipment of the same counterfeit oncology drugs I had been tracking for months. Right next to the fraudulent batch numbers sat Garrett Brooks's signature, a bold, sweeping flourish that confirmed his direct involvement in the scheme. He wasn't just a bystander to our father's greed. He was the gatekeeper who allowed the poison into the veins of unsuspecting patients. Garrett remained oblivious to my discovery, too busy laughing at the sight of me kneeling in the dirt. He told me to make sure the floor was spotless, claiming that even a janitor should have some pride in her failure, before he turned and walked away toward the elevator. I gripped the edge of the file, my fingers trembling not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the evidence I now held. The signature was the final piece of the puzzle, the smoking gun that connected the corporate boardroom to the hospital wards. My brother believed he had just enjoyed a moment of petty triumph, but in reality he had just signed the death warrant for his own career and the entire Brooks empire. I stood up, tucked the mental image of that document into my memory, and pushed my cart back into the shadows, ready to deliver the final blow. The invitation didn't arrive in a gilded envelope. It came through a jagged, demanding phone call from Martha Brooks. My mother's voice was a practiced blend of disappointment and cold authority, claiming that my grandmother's health was failing and that I owed it to the family to appear at the Brooks Group's 30th anniversary gala. She framed it as a final chance for me to stand before Arthur and beg for forgiveness, to admit that my life as a hospital janitor was a wretched mistake. Martha wanted me there to witness Garrett receiving the Excellence in Medical Leadership Award, a trophy meant to solidify his position as the heir apparent to the family legacy. I knew the invitation was a carefully laid trap, a stage set for my public humiliation to serve as a cautionary tale for their elite investors, but I accepted without a moment's hesitation. What they didn't realize was that I had already spent the last 48 hours finalizing a digital dossier that contained 3 years of meticulously gathered evidence. From the falsified clinical trials in my father's office to the treasonous signatures Garrett had scrawled on the counterfeit drug manifests at Boston Mercy, every piece of the puzzle was now encrypted and sitting in the secure inbox of the Federal Office of Inspector General. I had clicked the send button from my small Dorchester apartment just hours before putting on the only decent dress I still owned. I wasn't walking into the stateroom as a disgraced daughter looking for a way back in. I was walking in as the ultimate witness for a prosecution that was already in motion. The trap they had set for me was about to become the very cage that would hold them. The stateroom was a dizzying display of opulence, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the Boston skyline that seemed to mock the darkness of my recent years. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the high-stakes chatter of insurance conglomerates and private healthcare moguls. This wasn't just a celebration. It was a hunting ground where Arthur intended to secure new multi-million-dollar contracts for the very drugs I knew were lethal. I watched from the periphery as my parents moved through the crowd, shaking hands with the architects of the American medical system. I saw the arrogance in their smiles, the absolute certainty that they were untouchable because they held the keys to the treasure room. I stood near the service entrance, deliberately keeping my presence subtle while I waited for the clock to strike the appointed hour. My phone buzzed in my clutch bag, a short coded confirmation from Harrison Sterling. The federal strike team was in position, waiting for my signal that all primary targets were present. Despite the urge to scream the truth at the top of my lungs when I saw Garrett laughing with a group of investors, I maintained a mask of quiet submission. I allowed the passing waiters to ignore me and the guests to cast pitying glances at the woman who couldn't cut it in the real world. Every second of silence was a tactical choice, a necessary delay to ensure that when the hammer finally fell, no one in the Brooks inner circle would have a chance to escape through the shadows. The lingering echoes of my father's mockery had barely faded when the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open with a synchronized force that silenced the entire hall. The guests, still wearing their smug expressions from Arthur's janitor speech, turned in confusion as a line of men in dark tactical suits flooded the perimeter. At the center of the formation was Harrison Sterling, the regional director of the Office of Inspector General. He didn't offer a dramatic flourish or a grand announcement. He moved with the cold, efficient precision of a man who had seen too many corporate monsters hide behind silk veils. As he approached the podium where my family stood frozen, Sterling's eyes didn't linger on the diamond-encrusted watches or the expensive wine. He looked directly at me, his voice cutting through the stifling air like a winter wind. "Agent Brooks, step aside. We'll take it from here." The atmosphere shattered instantly. My father's face drained of all color, shifting from an arrogant bronze to a sickly, translucent gray. He tried to muster his usual authority, demanding to know the meaning of this intrusion on private property, but his voice cracked under the weight of Sterling's silence. Before Arthur could utter another word, a federal agent stepped forward to read the warrants. The charges were devastating and clinical: massive wire fraud conspiracy to defraud the United States government and the systematic distribution of adulterated drugs across 3 states. Garrett, who had been preening beside my father just moments ago, looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His hands, the hands that had signed those fraudulent manifests in the hospital basement, began to shake uncontrollably as the reality of his situation set in. Martha rushed forward, her voice a shrill shriek of denial as she tried to intervene, but the special agents blocked her path with the indifference of stone walls. I stood perfectly still, watching the scene unfold with a detached clarity. I saw Garrett's eyes dart toward me, a sudden horrific realization dawning on him. He finally understood that the failed sister he had humiliated in the supply room wasn't just a janitor. She was the ghost that had been haunting their ledgers for years. He realized that every bag of trash I had carried out of Boston Mercy was actually a piece of his own life being dismantled. The trash cart wasn't a symbol of my failure, it was the vehicle for his destruction. Sterling signaled his team, and the ballroom erupted into a controlled chaos of flashing cameras and legal service. Special agents began placing Arthur and Garrett into silver restraints, their cold metallic clicks sounding final and absolute against the backdrop of the city's skyline. As they were led away, Arthur turned his head toward me, his lips trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He didn't see a daughter anymore. He saw the person who had single-handedly executed the Brooks legacy. I didn't offer him a smile of triumph or a single word of spite. I simply watched the federal team begin the process of seizing every server and ledger in the room. The empire was no longer being celebrated. It was being dissected by the hand of justice. The chaotic storm of the federal raid slowly drifted out of the ballroom, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than the music and laughter that had preceded it. I stood by the grand floor-to-ceiling windows of the stateroom, watching the flashing blue and red lights of the law enforcement vehicles far below on the Boston streets. There was no surge of adrenaline, no desire to scream in triumph, only a profound sense of quietude. In the center of the room, Garrett Brooks sat slumped on the polished floor, his head in his hands, and his prestige shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. A few meters away, Arthur Brooks was being guided toward the service elevator by 2 special agents. his shoulders hunched as if the very weight of the skyscraper was crushing him. My mother Martha stood frozen like a marble statue, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a desperation that she knew I would never answer. I didn't walk over to them for a final confrontation. I didn't need to hear their excuses or witness their hollow apologies. Instead, I walked toward a young hospital administrator who was standing near the exit, pale and trembling. I reached into my clutch bag and pulled out the plastic Boston Mercy janitorial ID, the very badge Arthur had mocked just an hour ago. I handed it to the official with a steady hand, thanking him for the opportunity and officially resigning from my contract position. That badge was the last link to the life I had inhabited for 3 years, and giving it back felt like shedding a skin that had grown too tight. The man looked at the card, then at me, then back at the feds, unable to comprehend that the woman who cleaned his office was the architect of the evening's devastation. As I exited the building, the crisp Atlantic breeze hit my face, carrying the scent of salt and change. Waiting by my car was a courier with a secure federal envelope. Inside was a formal memorandum from Washington, D.C., signed by the Office of Inspector General, officially recalling me to the Capitol for a permanent senior position. My work in Boston was finished. The Brooks Group was already being liquidated by court-appointed receivers, and the dangerous oncology shipments had been intercepted nationwide. I looked back at the glowing tower one last time, realizing that the house I grew up in was never actually a home. It was merely a structure built on the suffering of others, a fortress of greed that I had been forced to dismantle to save my own soul. The ultimate lesson I carried away from that night wasn't about the power of revenge, it was about the definition of family. I understood now that blood doesn't grant anyone the right to demand your complicity in evil. Family is defined by the values we choose to protect and the integrity we refuse to sacrifice, even when the world tells us we are failing. By choosing the truth over the Brooks name, I had finally secured the only inheritance that mattered: my honor. As I drove toward the interstate, leaving the ruins of my father's empire behind, I felt a lightness I hadn't known in years. I was no longer a daughter, a sister, or a janitor. I was a protector of the light, heading toward a future that was entirely my own.